Okay, changing values in Western society after World War II. And, well, first off, we're going to say that between 1940 and 1945, the average family income triples. The US becomes a rich place. I said earlier, majority of industrialized countries were destroyed and the US was not. So while our factories were pumping out stuff, they were trying to rebuild all their buildings that had been knocked to the ground, and America becomes very rich. Richest country in the world, still are. We become more of an urban country. We were always kind of a farm-based country. And we're going to see after World War II, America becomes much more urban. And people with all this money have extra stuff, with all this money, they have money to buy extra stuff. And America becomes what's called a consumer-based society, where all of a sudden now, the American dream is created, or the American dream, where every American should have a house, 2 cars in the driveway, 2.5 kids. And this ideal kind of takes over American society. All Americans want to have television now. Television becomes a huge thing. And eventually computers, right, become a big thing here in America. America becomes a leader in innovation and inventions. We start to see a movement towards more people buying stuff on credit. And in the US and Europe, we're going to see that 900% of people, the amount of people who had cars went up 900%. Like, this just, car culture takes over. I mean, LA was kind of a big contributor to the increase in car culture. The San Fernando Valley, built after World War II, the entire valley almost. My house was built in the 50s. I grew up in a house that was built in Burbank. Burbank was a little earlier, 30s. But that's the idea, right? Everyone should just have a house. And you need to have a car to get to work now, because we're not all living in apartments in downtown. So car culture takes over. One of the big changes, we know that during the war, many women took over jobs in factories, all the jobs, because all the men were fighting, just like in World War I. And after the soldiers return, many women will give up their jobs. Not all. A lot of women keep them, though, this time. And there's a baby boom. We're going to see that in this era, this is called the baby boomer era, this wave of births, a lot of women had babies after the war. This is called the baby boomer generation. This is called Gen X. There's me. Right? Then the millennials, Gen Z. That's you. But anyways, but then after they have the babies, a lot of women say, "Look, my kids have grown. I want a job now. Look, we got to get some equality up in this place." In 1970, women started fighting. Well, in the 1960s, a movement is born called the Women's Liberation Movement. And women start demanding equal rights under the law, in the workplace, and in society. Remember that. Equal rights under the law, in workplace, and in society. Women were not getting paid equal. Some people suggest that the wage gap was as high as 41 cents to the dollar of what men would make in the 60s and 70s for women. I have a lecture on the modern wage gap in my economics course if you want to check it out. What is the modern wage gap? It's not this bad. Is it 82 cents to the dollar, or maybe closer to 95 cents? If you want to learn more about the modern wage gap, let me know. But it was a lot worse back then. Women were treated poorly in the workplace. There was a lot of what would be called sexual harassment today. Women had to put up with in the workplace in the 60s and 70s, and even early 80s. Women try and get a law passed in the 70s called the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. They want an amendment to the Constitution that says all women should have equal rights under the law, in society, and in the workplace. And they're not able to get it passed. America refuses to pass a law that simply says women have equal rights under the law, in the workplace, and in society. You can, and people are still fighting for it today. Virginia just passed the ERA. Colorado just passed the ERA less than 10 years ago. And there are still states in our country, there are still political movements, political parties, one political party in specific, that does not want to pass the ERA to give women equal rights under the law. Now, I know what you're saying, but women have close to equal rights now under the law. Okay, sure. We could probably nitpick and choose a few that's not equal, but it's pretty close to equal rights, right? In the workplace, well, maybe, sure. But what societally, that's a tough one, right? How do you pass equality societally? That evolves as the laws evolve. It's a trailer. It comes later. But I was told once, I asked, a professor, I said, why is this needed if women already have almost all equal rights under the law and in the workplace? And she says, for court, right? Because if this law was passed, then when lawsuits came up, they could cite this law, this amendment to the Constitution, and say, due to the 28th Amendment, boom. And it would make it a lot easier for women to sue when they're treated unfairly in court. But because of it, it's harder. I don't understand it. I'm not a lawyer, but that's what I was told. So the ERA sits unpassed. Women also start fighting for things about equal reproductive rights. Okay, and I think that the most famous one is the second one, right? So let's start with the first. Women didn't have the right to buy birth control pills until 1965. What? That's the surpriser, I think. Until 1965, you could deny women a right to buy a birth control pill, to take a pill to then control whether or not she gets pregnant. This is like basic stuff nowadays, but that was what they used to fight over. There were laws that said a woman could not buy a birth control pill to control whether or not she got pregnant. So 1965. Birth control pills are used for more than just pregnancy. They're also used to regulate your menstrual cycle. My sister used to take them when she was young, and she said it wasn't for pregnancy, but it was for other stuff. Okay, look. It has to do also with like ovarian cancer. To me, this is so hard to believe that women didn't have the right just to buy a simple medical pharmaceutical medicine that would help them control their reproductive health selves until 1965. And then 8 years later, the controversial one gets passed, right? And women get the right to have an abortion. Roe v. Wade, 1973. And I'm not going to argue that right now. That's a controversial one. Some people say it has to do with life. It's so controversial that one group is pro-life, one group is pro-choice. They're both pro something. No one wants to be against anything. I'm not going to fight the abortion argument today. So, yeah. Another crazy Supreme Court case, just for fun, while I'm on it, I should have talked about it earlier. The Loving Supreme Court case in the 60s. Interracial marriage was illegal in the 60s in America. Black and white people could not get married in the 60s in America. I was born in the 70s. It just makes me say, oh my gosh, 10 years before I was born, this country was a total different place. And it really, one of the things that changed this country were these people, the hippies. They came out against the Vietnam War. They believed in things like make love, not war. There were student protests to try and, because these people were being drafted to fight in the war. They were being forced. You have to go fight in a war you don't believe in. I said earlier, Cassius Clay changes his name to Muhammad Ali. And then he says, I'm not going to fight that war. They put him in jail. He said, but it's against my religion. They put him in jail. My father dodged the draft. Okay, my father got his draft card. And his mother wrote deceased on it. He lived in New York. They mailed it back in. He moved to Los Angeles. He changed his name from Salvatore Bergagliano to Salvatore Marina. That's my dad. He was a hippie who didn't want to fight in the war because he didn't want to fight in Vietnam. And you can see all these pictures here of these hippies, right? They changed, they really did change a lot of our country. They were also into like smoking pot. And a lot of the war on drugs, a lot of the laws that were passed by Nixon to try and attack and try and limit drug use were later turned out that he just wanted to be able to arrest hippies. Nixon did not like the hippies. He also said black people, I think. Is that true? Yeah, it is. In 1970, thousands of college students showed up at Kent State University to protest the war, and our government, it was the National Guard, the Ohio National Guard, they started shooting into the crowd. They killed hippies. They killed protesters who just peacefully showed up to protest what they thought was an unjust war. Today we know that these people greatly changed our country. In California, marijuana use is legal, and we know that we didn't really fight in any major wars at all after Vietnam until we were attacked on September 11th, and then we can get into the Afghanistan or Iraq war. But culture, there were some major cultural shifts in our countries from the 50s through the 60s into the 70s.